Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Stan Katz, and I'm on the faculty here at the Woodrow Wilson School, and I'm delighted to see such a terrific crowd for this event. You may already have noticed that this is an event that's in progress, as it were. It is our little Sorensen crisis at the moment, because Mr. Sorensen is in the car somewhere between exit 8A and the locals will understand what that means, and here. So it's going to take him a few minutes to get here. So the thing to do is for us to start, which is what we are going to do now. I'm going to reverse the order of the program. I think it will work out fine, but I do apologize for the need to do this. But we're talking about how to adapt to a crisis. So you're about to see how we do it here at the Woodrow Wilson School. And I will say, and he requires actually very little introduction, that Mr. Sorensen, of course, was President John F. Kennedy's special counsel and advisor. He was the principal speechwriter for JFK. His brief on the whole for the Kennedy administration, of course, was to be the advisor on domestic issues. But after the Bay of Pigs, he was asked to take part in international discussions as well. And he played a very important role, which he will talk about, in resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was the one who drafted Kennedy's correspondence with Nikita Khrushchev. He'll talk about all of that. And after he left the administration in, Sheldon and I were trying to work it out, I think it was early 1964, he in fact moved to Harvard for a year when he began to write his book on Mr. Kennedy. And I in fact met him at that time because I was the senior tutor of the residential college into which he moved that year. So I'm sorry that he's not here to lead off, but he will be here to speak slightly later. So we're going to move forward in this order then. I'm going to put Sheldon Stern on first, and then my colleague Julian Zelizer. Sheldon Stern was the historian of the John F. Kennedy Library in Cambridge, in Boston. I'm not getting any of this right. John F. Kennedy Library in Boston from 1977 to 1999. He worked while he was there extensively with the Kennedy tape recordings as they were being processed for release from 1983 to 1997. But he's also an extremely distinguished and well-published professional historian. He wrote Averting the Final Failure, John F. Kennedy and the Secret Cuban Missile Crisis Meetings, published by Stanford in 2003, and followed that up with a wonderful book, which I recommend to you, The Week the World Stood Still, Inside the Secret Cuban Missile Crisis, published also by Stanford in 2005. He is the preeminent historian of the crisis, and nobody knows the data as well as Mr. Stern does. And then he'll be followed by Julian Zelizer, who is a new colleague at the university. He's a professor in the Department of History and in the Woodrow Wilson School. He's a specialist in the history of public policy, and particularly the history of congressional policy and presidential policy in the United States. He wrote on Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences, 1948 to 2000, which won the Ellis Hawley Prize of the Organization of American Historian, and the LBJ Foundation's 1998 D.B. Hardiman Prize. He also wrote a wonderful book on an important subject of taxation called Taxing America, Wilbur D. Mills, Congress, and the State, 1945-1975, which won the Hawley Prize. And actually, I think this is repeated here. In any case, he is a prize-winning historian. He is a great teacher, and I want to say now that we're really delighted to have him here at the Woodrow Wilson School and in the history department. So I want to thank both of them for their cool under pressure, and I will proceed to put on Mr. Stern, then Julian will follow, and third we will have Mr. Sorensen. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Okay, well, my remarks were intended for a different place in the program in terms of length, etc., so I may have to add some things or whatever, but let me first just say very, very briefly that that our understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis remained, on the whole, fairly static from 1962 to 1987, because all the materials that were declassified that became available during that period were from the American side. And we really knew next to nothing about what had happened in Moscow or in Havana during the crisis. But after 1987, things changed. Excuse me, as a result of a series of international conferences which were inspired by Mikhail Gorbachev, the first in Moscow in 1989, and the last in Havana, appropriately enough, in early 1992. Then there was a follow-up in 2002 for the 40th anniversary. And all kinds of extraordinary things came out of those meetings, and this is not in my script, but I'm going to add this. For example, it was learned that Khrushchev had put 42,000 Red Army troops secretly into Cuba, which the Kennedy administration did not know. An extraordinary fact. Another example that came out in 1992 was that Khrushchev had placed tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and had given Russian officers as low as captain, under specific circumstances, the authority to use them in the event of an American invasion or American bombing. So certainly a lot of the things that had developed from the first two conferences, people were saying, well, you know, the crisis wasn't really that dangerous because neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev really wanted war. Well, but there was another side to that, and that is that even if people don't want something to happen, they may make some pretty stupid mistakes. Fortunately, nothing happened as a result of them. The other, of course, great change came beginning in 1983, as Professor Katz mentioned, with the opening of the tapes. And the tapes, I can't exaggerate the importance of the tapes, and it was my good fortune to have been in the right place at the right time and to become the first non-member of the XCOM to hear all these tapes. And I immediately realized that there was something extraordinary here. I remember coming home one night and saying to my wife, this would make a tremendous book, a narrative of these meetings. But of course it can't be done until the tape's declassified. And that didn't happen until finally early in 1997. And thus I took early retirement as quickly as possible after that and wrote Averting the Final Failure in order to do what I had hoped to do. And I think there really isn't time to talk about the condition of the tapes and all. I would just say one thing. For people who believe in vast, efficient government conspiracies and the efficiency of government in carrying out huge programs, if you knew in detail how the tapes were handled, you would no longer believe that. Their physical condition, the system by which they were numbered, if you could even call it a system, I mean, it was true chaos until it finally got sorted out. And unfortunately, one of the great discoveries of that sorting out process was the tape that I brought to play for you today, but unfortunately it will not play on this equipment. So you won't be able to hear it after all, which is really too bad. It is to me a source of great surprise that books continue to come out which cover the Cuban Missile Crisis, even sometimes in great detail. And when I look at the footnotes, I'm astounded to see that people have used transcripts, or in some cases my narrative, but have not listened to the tapes. And I mean, I understand that listening to the tapes is not easy. But if you're going to seriously write about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't see that there really is an alternative. And I think as an example, and this is purely imaginary, just imagine, for example, that somehow a recording of the original Gettysburg Address turned up, right? That somehow someone had found a way to record the Gettysburg Address in 1863. How many people writing about the Civil War and about Lincoln would simply read the speech without listening to it. Very few, I think. But it's strange. It doesn't seem to work that way with the tapes. Anyway, and another thing I want to address, which is what I call the great red herring about the tapes is, and I got no less than 9 citations. I won't bore you with them. They're in the book. 9 citations from people who say that the tapes can't really be taken seriously anyway because JFK and RFK knew they were being taped and therefore were selectively recording in order to make themselves look good down the road historically. That argument is truly laughable. And the most extreme example of that was William Safire of the New York Times in 1977, and I'd like to quote, this was when the first book of transcripts came out, the Harvard University Press book, and Safire wrote, quote, "The JFK tapes inherently lie. There pose the Kennedy brothers, knowing they are being recorded, taking care to speak for history, while their unsuspecting colleagues think aloud and contradict themselves the way honest people do in a crisis. The ex-con tapes do not present pure, raw history, since JFK knew the tape was rolling and was able to turn the meetings," this is a quote, "into a charade of entrapment, half history in the making, half image in the manipulating. And you can be sure of some outright deception by turning off the machine at key moments." Marvelous, except it's complete nonsense. And I want to show you why it's nonsense with 4 fundamental reasons. Number 1, if you think of the infamous conversation between Linda Tripp and Monica Lewinsky on a telephone, it might be possible to manipulate a telephone conversation to elicit a particular outcome. But how would you do that in a meeting like the ex-con meetings with 15 people in a room under incredible tension and stress? How would it be physically and tactically possible? Kennedy was able to turn on the machine, the switch was under the table in front of his chair. He did not have any access to any controls. They were someplace else taken care of by his secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. He didn't have access to play, forward, record, playback, and above all, he didn't have access to a real-time timer. And in any case, even if he did, how would he do it without being seen? I mean, people would see what he was doing. So the idea is preposterous on its face, but that's really the simplest way of refuting it. Really, the far more important argument, of course, is that why would he bother? Kennedy believed in 1962, and he was absolutely correct, that these tapes were his private property. That when he left the White House, they would go with him, and he could do with them whatever he liked. He intended to use them, of course, to write his memoirs. But he never, in his wildest imagination, ever thought that they would be made public. How could he have foreseen the Watergate scandal, the Freedom of Information Act, and the Presidential Records Act, which essentially forced the openings of these materials? How could he have ever imagined that was going to happen? He would have picked and chosen, when he wrote his memoirs, leaving out the stuff he wanted left out, leaving out references that he didn't like, or that he didn't think made him look good, or whatever, as all people writing memoirs do. As he told John Kenneth Galbraith, right shortly after the crisis, and I think this line tells us a lot. He said, "Ken, you will never know how much bad advice I had." And I think it's the never know, because he simply assumed that Kenneth Galbraith would never hear those tapes, and he certainly assumed that I would never hear them, or anybody else. But now, of course, we all know how much bad advice he had. Next argument, using Safire's logic, what about Richard Nixon, the president that Safire worked for in the White House? Nixon knew he was being taped, and he repeatedly incriminated himself. Why? Because for the same exact reason. The tapes were his personal property. He never intended that they would be, or never imagined that they would be released. He had to be compelled to release them by the United States Supreme Court, which is something he never imagined would happen. Indeed, if he had destroyed the tapes, early in the process, before the Senate hearings, could never have been forced from office, because that's where all the key evidence was, because he assumed that those tapes would never see the light of day. And finally, the most important reason, and the reason that I think is especially important to historians, is that proves the validity of the tapes, is the simple fact that the two Kennedys, the brothers, how could they have known at the time when they were in the middle of dealing with the crisis which position would look good in the future? How could they know that? And I'll give you one example. There were so many, but just one in the limited time we have. When JFK met on the 19th on the 22nd, the 19th with the Joint Chiefs and 22nd with the leaders of Congress, and he told both groups that he was going to blockade Cuba. They were both extremely angry and opposed the blockade, which they thought was not strong enough. In addition, they argued that it was an extremely risky move because there were a lot of Soviet MiGs in Cuba which could fly in under American radar and bomb and strafe American cities in Florida and in the Southeast. That was number one. And secondly, what if they decided to launch any operable ICBMs from Cuba in response to the blockade? Well, we know now those things didn't happen. But what if they did? What if they had happened, which was entirely possible? And then, assuming that any tapes of historians had survived, we would now be listening to the same tapes, and we would now say the Joint Chiefs were right. The leaders of Congress were right. Kennedy was wrong. He should have done what they said. He should have knocked out those sites. He should have bombed those sites. So how would he know in advance, before the events actually occurred, before the crisis was actually resolved? I mean, I think the Sapphire point is preposterous. Maybe I've spent too much time saying that. If the outcome had been different, and of course, history is not a play. There is no script. As JFK told the ex-com, and these are his words, on the morning that the quarantine or the blockade was going into effect, he said, quote, "What we are doing is throwing down a card on the table in a game which we don't know the ending of." And I think that sums up very much the point that I've been trying to make. Now, the other thing I would like to talk about in the time I have left is what kinds of special insights one gets from the tapes that you can't get from any other source. Certainly, if you're talking about Kennedy and Kennedy as a crisis manager, there is more on the tapes than anybody could ever imagine. If you have a discerning ear and the temperament to listen, you see in action the nuances of his voice, his impatience, which was quite frequent, his Cold War assumptions and convictions, his doubts, his blind spots, his political instincts, his quick mind, his self-control, his persistence, which was very important, his caution, his skepticism about military solutions to political problems, and his sardonic sense of humor. Okay, let's wait for Ted Sorensen. All right, now where was I? There are so many things, again, if I had more time, one of them that is particularly striking to me is the escalating tension between President Kennedy and his National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy. Bundy was a brilliant man. He was also very abrasive and many people have said very arrogant. I had lunch with him many times when he was working on his book at the Kennedy Library, and I didn't think that that was true at all. He couldn't have been nicer. But when you listen to him on the tapes, you do see that he sometimes seemed to forget that he wasn't the president. And he kept saying, I would, and Kennedy reacted in several cases, and you can see it escalating over the period of the meetings. I have only two examples that I would read to you. In the first week, JFK had just reiterated that all the missile bases in Cuba could not be destroyed by airstrikes, and therefore airstrikes were a terrible risk. Bundy reacted, and I think I would say in a very condescending tone of voice. He said, "Entirely true, Mr. President, but I don't think the next few days is the time for us to talk about it." And then Kennedy responded with, you can hear the irritation, "Well, I know, but I want everybody to understand it, Mac, if you don't mind." And you know, that edge. And I should say, by the way, that the Kennedy's even-tempered responses during these meetings is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I wish I could play the tape of General LeMay, the things that General LeMay said to him, and he never lost his temper. It is really quite remarkable. And the other example from the final day, the Saturday, the 27th, when the ex-com learned, to their great chagrin, that Khrushchev had just made a public offer on Moscow radio to withdraw the missiles from Cuba if the United States took its missiles out of Turkey. Now, just the previous evening, Friday evening, he had sent a diplomatic message, not made public, saying that he would withdraw the missiles in exchange for an American pledge not to invade Cuba again, not to re-invade Cuba. And now at first, as a matter of fact, at first, very interesting, when they first hear it, they say, "Is that the same message? Was that in last night's message?" I mean, they're not, it wasn't quite clear until they realized, no, this is a separate message. This is not what he said last night. And immediately, Kennedy picks up on the fact that this message is public, that the world knows what Khrushchev has said, and that there's no way that the United States can avoid making this kind of concession. And Kennedy says, and these are his words, "Most people will regard this trade as not an unreasonable proposal. I'll just tell you that." And Bundy responded again very disdainfully, "But what most people, Mr. President?" Kennedy shot back, "It will be impossible to justify attacking Cuba after Khrushchev has said, if you get yours out of Turkey, we'll get ours out of Cuba. I think you've got a pretty tough one here." And Bundy replied, "I don't see why we have to pick that track when he's offered us the other track in the last 24 hours. And this is the key sentence. Kennedy says, and the annoyance in his voice is so clear, he said, "Well, he's now offered us a new one." And I want to try and reproduce the way he says this sentence. He says, "I think we have to be now thinking about what our position is going to be on this one, because this is the one before us and before the world." But he says it this way, "I think we have to," and you hear this not only somewhat suppressed laugh, which I interpret as a very derisive laugh, a laugh in which he seemed, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, to be saying, why doesn't this guy understand why this cannot be rejected? And that's exactly how he says it. The other example that I want to spend just a couple of minutes on is and it relates to this last point, of course, is the famous trollop ploy, which Ted Sorensen certainly knows a great deal about. Which first appeared in Robert Kennedy's 13 Days. Actually, it first appeared in a Saturday Evening Post article in December of 1962. But the notion was that the administration had negotiated its way out of the crisis by the brilliant tactic of responding to Khrushchev's Friday offer. We'll take them out if you promise not to invade Cuba, and ignoring his Saturday offer. And this was supposedly Robert Kennedy's brilliant idea. We now know, of course, that this is not true. It's not true. Obviously, something had to be done in the immediate aftermath of the crisis to conceal the secret deal to remove the missiles from Turkey that was negotiated on Saturday evening by Robert Kennedy and Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin of the Soviet Union. So there was really no choice in 13 days. He could not reveal this. This didn't come out until 1989. But the problem is that the persistence of this notion, and you can clearly hear on the tapes that this did not happen. Kennedy says repeatedly, this will not work. He's not going to go for the Friday proposal because he's now made the Saturday proposal, and it's a public one. There is no way that we're going to get out of this without some sort of deal on the Turkish missiles. He must say it 20 times over the course of that day, and they're all quoted in my book. And finally, of course, he sends his brother, who ironically had opposed the deal at the meetings, to meet with de Brennan and to come up with the deal. Incidentally, it's also fascinating to know, which we did not know until much more recently, that Kennedy was concerned that, well, I just don't have the time to explain all of this. There was concern that the difference in the two messages reflected a possible coup d'etat or some sort of power shift in Moscow, that perhaps Khrushchev had been pushed aside by the hardliners, who had now upped the ante in the Saturday message, the Saturday offer. And there was great concern that maybe they would reject the deal worked out between de Brennan and Bobby Kennedy. Well, in order to deal with that, JFK and Secretary of State Dean Rusk orchestrated a fallback plan, a secret fallback plan, by which the United Nations Secretary General, Utah, would announce that he had a neutral third-party proposal to end the missile crisis, which was essentially the deal that had been negotiated. And the reason that Kennedy hoped that this would work is, as he says, if they want war, he says, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. But unless they're crazy, why would they turn down a neutral third-party deal which we have accepted? So in other words, as soon as Utah announced it, Kennedy would accept it. And the theory was, well, how could the Russians not accept it unless they were crazy and wanted a nuclear war? So that was the fallback, which is extraordinarily important to understand. Finally, how much time do I have left?
You should stop soon.
Okay, I'm going to leave out so much, which I hate to do, but maybe some of it will be able to be used in some of your questions. Although I just have to put in this wonderful quote when General Shoup, the commandant of the Marine Corps, spoke his piece on the 19th against the blockade and why it was so important to hit the sites and knock them out. And Kennedy said, knocking out the sites, he said, could prompt the firing of these nuclear missiles against American cities, resulting in 80 to 100 million casualties. You're talking about the destruction of a country. That's his response. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, we're very lucky he was making the decisions. So let me leave it to this. I just want to give you a list of things that were proposed by either the ex-com or the congressional leaders or the Joint Chiefs, which JFK either rejected or at the very least postponed, any one of which could have had disastrous effects. So let me just read these to you very quickly, and then I will sit down. He rejected mining international waters around Cuba. He rejected declaring war in conjunction with announcing the quarantine. He rejected objecting, I'm putting this, that's very bad grammar. He said, let us not interfere with the Russians if they want to inspect our trucks going into Berlin. It isn't worth creating a problem over something like that. He said, let them do it. He rejected using belligerent language in an official proclamation. He rejected seizing a Soviet ship that had reversed course near Cuba. He rejected enforcing the quarantine by attacking a Soviet submarine in Cuban waters. He rejected arming U.S. reconnaissance planes and returning Cuban ground fire. He rejected initiating night surveillance over Cuba using flares. And finally, and this was the most important by far because he had decided 2 days earlier that he would do it, and then he backed off. He decided against immediately destroying a Soviet SAM site or all the SAM sites if a U-2 was shot down over Cuba, which of course happened on Saturday and he did not authorize that military move. He tried to buy time. And he tried to buy time simply because he was determined to avoid his words in the title of my book, The Final Failure, which of course is nuclear war. Okay, thank you.
Most Americans like to believe that politics stops at the water's edge. And even when we know this is not the case in the current era, there's a nostalgia that things were somehow different in the past. But nothing can be further from the truth. And as we start to think about how there was never really a firewall that separated national security from the world of electoral politics, we start to better understand American political history. And we also can learn about familiar events such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in a new light. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often treated in isolation of the political context that surrounded it. This is a classic moment where diplomacy triumphed and politics was pushed to the background. Pressure, we learn, came from the military, but not from the electoral system. The story usually starts in mid-October. If you see the movie that came out a few years ago, it begins with the discovery of the photographs. But I would actually start the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis in August, as Republicans were gearing up for the midterm elections of 1962. And by doing that, we start to see the heated political context that the Kennedy administration faced, and the heated political atmosphere that existed in the early 1960s on the road to Vietnam. During the early 1960s, one of the most dangerous national security challenges politically to Democrats came when Republicans focused their attention on Cuba. Republicans had lost many of the gains they had made in the early 1950s that culminated with the 1952 election, as Democrats in the mid-1950s focused on issues such as the missile gap with the Soviet Union. But Republicans had been re-energized for many reasons when Kennedy took office. And many of their attacks early on focused on Cuba, especially following the Bay of Pigs and moving into August 1962, when Republicans honed in on the threat of a Soviet buildup that they said was taking place in Cuba. Again, this was in August of 1962, not October. As we've learned from the tapes, a buildup was taking place in June for all the reasons we just discussed. The administration was worried about the impact of these rumors that were circulating in Washington and what effect they might have on the Democrats. The summer of '62 was shaping up to be a tough period. The economy had started to slow. Tensions over civil rights were heating up. There was a lot of concern about the southern states and southern opposition to the president. And Kennedy, most importantly, needed to diminish the numbers of the conservative coalition in Congress if he hoped to achieve many of his domestic ambitions. On August 14th, Kennedy acknowledged to reporters there was evidence of large quantities of material coming in to Cuba from the Soviet Union, but he said there was nothing threatening about the material, nothing that could facilitate some kind of attack on the U.S. There were some troubling CIA reports, but in general, they were treated with a degree of skepticism, with lack of evidence, again, that there was an offensive threat that was building up in the Soviet Union. And there was also some distrust of the CIA director, John McCone, who was a hardline anti-communist Republican working in the administration. But one of the remarkable, often forgotten facts is that throughout August, the Republican Party was attacking the administration on this issue. Senators Kenneth Keating and Homer Capehart of Indiana were heading the attack in Congress, again, attacking Kennedy in August for not responding to a threat in Cuba. Keating was a serious presidential candidate, discussed in many circles, and he was relying on anti-communism to strengthen his support among Republicans. The Senator Capehart of Indiana was a die-hard conservative, one of the Kennedy administration's toughest critics following the early policy problems in Cuba. Concerned about Republican opponents inside and outside Congress, the president did not want any U2 information leaked to the media, very aware that this would just turn into political fodder for the GOP and obviously exacerbate tensions with the Soviet Union. And given that there was no sense that a real offensive threat existed, there was no reason to reveal information that was known. Kennedy sensed that he had to calm these political storms, though. Even though the administration did not have a plan of action, the president told Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy that he would, quote, invite the leadership down here, the Republican key gas bags, and others to undermine Republican claims that the administration was withholding information. Following a tense meeting on September 4th, Kennedy searched for a middle ground. He did hold a press conference where he says that he will use whatever means may be necessary to respond to Soviet aggression. He also reminded reporters that there was no evidence that the Cubans had gained significant offensive capability. On September 6th, the CIA reports that it had found surface-to-air missiles under construction and 8 patrol boats with short-range surface-to-surface missiles, and that's the following day when Kennedy asked Congress for standby authority to call up men from the ready reserve. Kennedy's responses failed to satisfy most Republicans. Barry Goldwater, future presidential candidate, said, quote, the American people will not be satisfied with the president's reiteration of a do-nothing policy toward Cuba. On September 12th, Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield informed the president that the Senate Majority Policy Committee, that in a meeting there was a, quote, great deal of concern over the, quote, domestic political implications of the situation in Cuba. The feeling among senators, Mansfield explained, was that a, quote, do something gesture of militancy had become necessary. At a meeting, Democrats had discussed, Mansfield said, a full array of actions from quarantine to military actions, and there was some talk, Mansfield said, that those Democrats running for re-election in November would have to leave you on this matter unless something were done. While Mansfield supported the administration, he feared, again, quote, if public pressures on Democratic members now begin to lead them to engage in an attempt to outdo Republican militancy on Cuba, I am concerned as to where this might end. To turn up the heat under Kennedy, Republicans proposed a resolution that would authorize the president to use American troops in Cuba if necessary. The president sensed that if he did not agree to a tough resolution, Republicans would start building support in Congress for something even worse. This was a perennial fear of Democrats during this period. The resolution proclaimed that the U.S. would not allow Cuba to develop a military capacity that threatened the nation. And even though Kennedy agreed to this, Republicans still used it to claim credit that they were the ones driving the debate over Cuba. The political pressure continues to become intense. In very early October, the administration is contemplating a possible blockade. On October 7th, Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois charged that the Soviets had completed 8 missiles in Cuba, with 16 more being built. On October 9th, the president authorizes a new round of U-2 reconnaissance missions over the island. Early, the president deals with some of these issues on the campaign trail. In early October, he goes to Indiana to lend his support to Birch Bayh's campaign against Senator Capehart. During one speech, the president warned that, quote, these self-appointed generals and admirals who want to send somebody else's sons to war and who consistently voted against the instruments of peace ought to be kept home by the voters and be replaced by someone like Birch Bayh, who has some understanding of what the 20th century is all about. Republicans, though, responded with equal vigor. On October 10th, Senator Keating warned, quote, my own sources on the Cuban situation, which have been 100% reliable, he says, have substantiated this report completely. 6 launching sites are under construction. pads which will have the power to hurl rockets into the American heartland and as far as the Panama Canal zone. The speech constituted the most direct challenge to Kennedy's statements that there was no reason to be concerned about Cuba. His words, according to one senior CIA officer, quote, hit like a bombshell in the White House. On the same day that Keating delivered his speech, McCone had shown Kennedy photographs of Soviet ships carrying crates to Cuba that some advisors believe might have dangerous material. During a speech on October 15th, again, remember the dates, October 15th, before the crisis really unfolds, President Eisenhower makes a speech in which he former President Eisenhower, in which he attacks the dreary foreign record of the past 21 months. And many in the media interpreted that speech as a sign that the Republicans were agreeing to use these issues on the campaign trail. And then the floodgates opened. On the morning of October 16th, the president is shown the first hard evidence of the missile sites in Cuba. According to presidential advisor Kenny O'Donnell, the president approached him in the morning and asked if he still thought that all the fuss about Cuba was politically unimportant. Absolutely, O'Donnell said, according to his recollection, and he assured Kennedy that voters don't give a damn about Cuba. Kennedy then showed him the photographs. After inspecting them, O'Donnell said he couldn't believe his eyes. You'd better believe it, the president said. We've just elected Capehart in Indiana, and Ken Keating will probably be the next president of the United States. The final photographs were delivered the exact same day that the Republican National Committee proclaimed that they were going to focus in the final weeks of the campaign on foreign policy. William Miller, chair of the Republican National Committee, issued a statement on October 16th that was endorsed by Senator Goldwater and Representative Robert Wilson of California, saying, "We are distressed to note that administration spokesmen in their campaign speeches have studiously avoided forthright discussion of foreign policy. If we were asked to state the issue in one word," they said, "that word would be Cuba, symbol of the tragic irresolution of the administration." By October 18th, according to a study in Congressional Quarterly, Cuba had emerged as a top campaign issue, according to polls of congressmen and media editors. The president faced, as we know, tremendous pressure from military members of his inner circle to respond militarily, as they said that Soviets would read Kennedy's decision not to employ military force as a signal they could do what they wanted without fear. But as LeMay chided the president, and the Republican speeches about Cuba were very much in his mind, we know that Kennedy resisted the urge and the pressure to use military force. Kennedy stood up firm to the military and to these Republican attacks, and polls revealed that the public was with him. Even as Senator Goldwater was calling for force, polls were showing that most Americans were not in favor of using armed forces, at least. And as he deliberated, though, Kennedy had this context in mind. Notwithstanding his private fears, what's amazing about the tapes is that Kennedy refuses to make a political issue after it begins of the crisis. If you search through the recordings and minutes of the executive meetings, there are very few discussions of political considerations as Kennedy and his staff deliberated over the opinions. Even when the president was still on the campaign trail in the earliest days after October 16th, he didn't really talk about Cuba. In the end, Kennedy decides on the quarantine. Attempting to stop Republican attacks, Kennedy does instruct the CIA director to update President Eisenhower about the new photographs and his decision to impose a quarantine. On October 22nd, the president meets with congressional Democrats and Senator Dirksen to tell them he was leaning toward a quarantine rather than a military strike. Senator Richard Russell, the powerhouse in the Senate, responded by saying, "I think that our responsibilities demand stronger steps than that in view of this buildup." He said to the president, "We're either a first-class power or we're not." Later, Kennedy will make his famous appearance and explain the position of the administration on television. Lyndon Johnson will report that congressmen were much happier with the speech than with the private meeting. At first, many Republicans promised to leave the crisis out of the campaign after it becomes public. According to the reporter Arthur Kroc, the issue which the Republicans sought to make paramount in the 1962 congressional campaign was that President Kennedy had failed to do something about the transformation of Cuba into a Soviet missile base. Hence, this issue, Kroc said, is now dead. Many Republicans initially say they'll support the president and again leave this issue out, but what they also do is still question why was this revealed so late in October and whether there was political motivation behind the timing of the announcement. Some also suggest that all Kennedy is doing is reiterating what Republicans have been calling for since August. The president and his brother acknowledged privately that they were vulnerable to some of these attacks. At a meeting of ExComm on October 23rd, Robert Kennedy said, "What we're doing now is in fact closing the barn door after the horse is gone." In the end, the administration is able to reach a deal with the Soviets, which we have heard about, both the promise not to invade Cuba and the secret deal to remove missiles from Turkey after the midterm elections are part of the deal. According to Tom Wicker, quote, "Since 1952, when the frustration of the Korean War stalemate gave the Republicans the opening for attacks on this line, they have persistently pictured themselves as the party that knew best how to deal with communists." Wicker says, now having gone as near the brink of war as the Republican administration of Eisenhower ever did, with dramatic results, Kennedy and his party have gone a long way toward scotching this recurrent theme against them. It didn't take long, though, for partisanship to come right back. Right after the crisis was solved, going into the election, Eisenhower boasts that Republicans deserve the credit, not the administration, for having pushed the administration to take a tough stand against the Cubans. The attacks don't work. The midterm elections are a success for Kennedy. Democrats expand their Senate majority, only have a few losses in the House, and this is a very good showing for the White House, better than any since 1934. And some of Kennedy's top critics on Cuba, including Richard Nixon, running in the state of California for governor, lose. However, the election doesn't provide Kennedy with much comfort. By 1963, Republicans are charging that the president had covered up CIA warnings that had taken place early on. They are charging that he failed to authorize U-2 reconnaissance flights in important weeks in September 1962. And some Republicans are charging in 63 that the administration had reached a secret deal over missiles in Turkey in exchange for ending this crisis, which we now know was true. By the end of the crisis, though, Kennedy had greatly strengthened the political standing of liberal internationalism. Faced with a concerted effort by Republicans to use national security to regain electoral ground, Kennedy's skillful performance during the Cuban Missile Crisis and its ultimate resolution without war became yet another model of how Democrats could handle national security quite effectively. But Kennedy had not eliminated the Republican right or these Republican attacks from this scene, and the heated political competition over national security continued. Once we see the political pressure that Kennedy and his advisors faced on this position, I think we have a better understanding of the often forgotten role of conservatives in the early 1960s and the pressures for a more hawkish agenda that were building during this period. According to Ken O'Donnell, once again, President Kennedy recalled the politics of 1950 in a conversation they had over Vietnam when he said, "If I tried to pull out completely now from Vietnam, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands. But I can do it after I'm reelected, so we better make damn sure that I'm reelected." in more colorful language. And this is a quote, which you always have to say when quoting President Johnson, as he reacted to campus protests over Vietnam in 1965, Johnson said the following to Undersecretary of State George Ball, quote, "Don't pay attention to what those little shits on the campus do. The great beast is the reactionary element in this country." And these fears of the right were not irrational, they were not made up, and they made sense in this period. And I think the partisan context that surrounded this Cuban Missile Crisis can help us see a little bit about what Lyndon Johnson was so scared about. Thank you.
Okay, why don't you come up here? Right now? Yes.
Hello, I'm Ted Sorensen, the only member. If I may say so, the only member of this panel who was actually there. And that makes quite a difference. I'm very sorry that as a result of traffic congestion in New York City that I'm late. So happens that 40 years ago I taught a Wednesday night seminar in this school on presidential decisions in foreign policy. And I am still in touch with some of my students, one of whom reminded me not long ago that I was late my first night and that I began by telling of the former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who was in China on a state visit when he received word early in the morning in his hotel room that his government had just been overthrown and there was a price on his head. And he came down that morning and there was a crowd of press and dignitaries there awaiting him, and he began by saying, "I'm very glad to be here." I'm also sorry to have missed earlier presentations, particularly Stan Katz quoting from the tapes, and I look forward to his book. I am less impressed with I don't know the other members of the panel, sorry, and I don't see very well, but I'm less impressed by quotations from newspaper accounts at the time, which were about as accurate as the media is today, and from some of the other books that have been written about the Cuban Missile Crisis, most of which also relied on those same newspapers or on each other's books. And time simply does not permit me to add, correct, revise, supplement as I would like some of what I have heard here today. Not surprisingly, I will talk to you primarily about President Kennedy, for whom I worked 11 years, and his role in guiding this country safely through what historians have quite justifiably called the 13 most dangerous days in the history of mankind. It was on that day, October 16, when the president called me into his office and told me that Soviet nuclear missiles of a range sufficient to reach most parts of the United States and many parts of the Western Hemisphere had been located on the island of Cuba as a result of the U-2 overflight planes, which could take extraordinary pictures from 50,000 feet up. He faced an array of decisions, and I will try to summarize them by describing them very succinctly. Who? When? What? How? Why? First question is who? Whom was he going to turn to for advice? not those who had been through previous nuclear confrontations. There had never been a previous nuclear confrontation in the world. He did not want to summon the National Security Council into session. Security Council sessions, it was very prestigious. And so, of course, you had to bring your deputy with you. And, of course, the deputy had to bring his special assistant with him, and pretty soon it had ballooned into what the president regarded as too large a meeting to make an efficient decision that would stay quiet. And so instead, he told me he was going to gather that
public rhetoric, and for that matter, by allied leaders, other, as I said, than the Bolsheviks. Number one. And number two, the way he introduces it is not as something that is to say, here, I have this bright new idea about how the world should be ordered, and here's what it is, it's self-determination. It's an imperative principle of action which statesmen will ignore at their peril, meaning it's already there, it's already being acted upon in the world, and we statesmen have to catch up to it. So I think he really perceived self-determination, or in his support for self-determination, as supporting something that the people of the world, as he saw them, and he really, I think, saw himself at this point not just as an American leader, but as a voice for people across the world. That the people of the world wanted self-determination, and it was his responsibility as a global leader to give it to them. Now, so I think that therefore it's important when we talk about the influence of Wilson on the colonial world to understand what I think I have understood through this research is that it isn't really a question of the dissemination of ideas. It isn't that Wilson had a bright new idea and people in Egypt or India or China heard him and said, wouldn't that be nice? Self-determination. How come we didn't think of this earlier? In fact, they had thought of it earlier. And the ideas that Wilson talks about are not new at all. In fact, they have long historical roots that go back at least to Immanuel Kant. And nationalist leaders in all these places were very familiar with notions of self-government, of the notion of consent in government, self-determination. Even if they were not familiar with the phrase, they were familiar with the notion. And what Wilson meant for colonial nationalists is not a new set of ideas that they hadn't heard before. What it meant is that an idea or a vision that had been distant, that had been somewhere in the perhaps in the very distant and undiscernible future, was now at hand. That's the meaning of the talk of the dawn of a new era. They thought not that Wilson had new ideas, but that Wilson had the power and the will to implement these ideas. That's the reason, I think, for what I call the Wilsonian moment of 1919. Not the sense of that there are new ideas here, but the sense that there are new possibilities, and that changes could now occur in the way international relations are governed, in the way in which colonial powers do their business, that were not possible before. And in this, they shared the sentiment with Wilsonians and progressives in Europe and in North America. This wasn't a peculiar notion to the colonial world, although it had a particular meaning for colonial peoples. So you find, for example, as the war ends, in the Indian press, when the news of the armistice come, you have editorial writers hailing the Allied victory as meaning no less than, and I quote, the freedom of nations, the right of self-determination. And one writer declared it a sin if India does not lay her ailments before Dr. Wilson. Another editorial writer said, if Poland, Belgium, Serbia, and even the African colonies are to be given the right of self-determination, will there not be the same standard of right and privilege for India? We appeal to India to rise to the occasion. Nations are not granted such opportunities often. Salvation is at hand, and it can be effected now or never. Let India bestir herself and move heaven and earth to get a hearing at the peace conference. So you have a sense that the peace conference, with Wilson at its head, is, if you will, a sort of transformative space. If we can only get there, if we can only make our case in those Wilsonian terms, things will happen, things will change. The British will not be able, in this case the British, will not be able to resist the force of history. Now, it does, thinking about these terms, and of course I can bring really dozens more quotations from Chinese papers, Koreans, Egyptians, others. It does raise the question of credibility. Why was Wilson believed, and I think someone mentioned Lloyd George, who also uses the term self-determination, not believed? Well, part of it, I think, is a sense which existed at the time that the United States, though a great power, was different than other great powers, despite the fact that it did have colonies and was involved in imperialism. Let me just give you one example. The famous Indian poet, Nobel Prize winner, Rabindranath Tagore, who was quite critical of American racism, had visited the United States during the war years, nevertheless wrote, and I quote, somehow I have an impression that America has a great mission in the history of Western civilization, for it is rich enough not to concern itself in the greedy exploitation of weaker nations. Its hands are free, and perhaps it will hold up the torch of freedom before the world. And this theme of America being rich enough not to need the exploitation of poorer nations is a central theme. You find it among Chinese writers. You find it among others. Let me just give one other example. Let me see if I can find that one other example. Well, I can't find the quote right now, but the Chinese Confucian philosopher Kang Youwei had similar sentiments about Wilson's coming as being the implementation of the Confucian vision of what's called in Chinese datong, the great peace of the world. And he compared Wilson to Confucius, a man who could combine scholarship and politics and moral purity in one package. And so almost saw Wilson as this ideal traditional Chinese scholar politician. How long do I have? A couple of minutes. Okay, all right. Okay. So as I said, if we think about how this happened, why these ideas that Wilson seemed to stand for were so influential, one obvious reason is their relevance to colonial people. Another obvious reason is their elasticity. They could mean different people. Self-determination could mean different people. It could mean different things, to different people. And the third one, which I mentioned before, I think is perhaps the most important, is power. These ideas seem to have power behind them. They seem to be on the verge of implementation, and this seemed to be an opportunity which could not be missed. So I think if we look at it that way, we see an aspect of Wilsonianism which we haven't yet talked about, which is Wilsonianism and the Wilsonian moment of 1919 as a crucial transformative moment in the history of anti-colonial nationalism, and even more broadly in the history of the transformation of the international arena from an arena of empires to an arena of states, of nation states, and the process of the delegitimation of empire. I think Wilson was crucial for that, not entirely intentionally, although not entirely unintentionally, and we can perhaps in Q&A talk about what Wilson had in fact intended colonial peoples, if anything, to understand from his rhetoric. And I think we're also reminded of the possibility of an American president being a global hero, even, and perhaps especially in this case, in the Middle East. And let me just end with a quote from the same Haikal obituary with which I started, which
brought with me, who has the actual photographs taken from 50,000 feet up to prove to you that these Soviet missile sites are there. And de Gaulle waved him off saying, no, the word of the President of the United States is good enough for me. Times have changed. He also wanted to answer the question who, by taking America's case against the missiles to the United Nations. And the one good thing about, or one of many good things about the movie 13 Days, it was, on the whole, an accurate movie conveying what happened and the terrible risks we were in and the cool leadership of the president. My wife says it would have been better if only somebody else had been available to play me, but Warren Beatty wasn't available. And, so that movie conveyed quite accurately Ambassador Adlai Stevenson's strong presentation of the U.S. case in the Security Council, which by chance was presided over during that month by the Soviet ambassador. And then the WHO went still one more dimension. The State Department, including its legal advisor, Abe Shays, now departed, but a wonderful international lawyer, pointed out that the United Nations Charter, and Kennedy was very careful to comply with the United Nations Charter on several different points, had a special arrangement for regional security activities. And the State Department then took our case to the Organization of American States, which is like a little Latin or Western Hemisphere, United Nations. Presented our case and won from the OAS, and not only an endorsement, but participation in the blockade, or quarantine as we called it, and that transformed the U.S. action into a regional action consistent with the United Nations Charter. So Kennedy's answers to that question, who, made a great deal of sense. Next question I said was when, and you heard me say that morning. He didn't say, I'm going to, you fellas take care of this now, I'm going to take a month off and cut the brush on my ranch. They call it a ranch, although there are no horses or cows on the ranch. No, he said, I'm calling the meeting this morning. And at 11:30 that morning, about a dozen of us were assembled in the cabinet room for the first discussion. And he wanted us to formulate a plan, and he wanted it within a week. A week because he figured that a secret in Washington in those days could at best last a week if it were known to only 13 people. If it were known to any more, it wouldn't last that long, nor does it today. But he felt we had an advantage because as of that morning of October 16th, the Soviets did not know that we knew. And that gave us the ability, for as long as that lasted, to plan without threats, pressure, or preemptive actions by the Soviet Union. Also gave us an opportunity to plan without the kinds of Republican attacks and pressures that were mentioned by by the previous speaker, or from the press, or from the Congress. And that also turned out to be a wise decision. But to keep word from leaking out or even prevent too much accurate speculation, he urged all of us to keep to our regular schedules, keep our commitments. The Vice President was off traveling all week. The President didn't mind that too much. And he kept to his own commitments. He had a meeting on his mental retardation plan that same day. He had, on the crucial day, October 22nd, which has been mentioned and which I'll come back to, he met with the President of Uganda, and then he had such an enjoyable discussion with him about education and schools in Uganda that finally I was asked by the other members of ExCom to go in and interrupt the meeting and get the President out because things were marching on toward the plans for a nationwide announcement of everything that evening. The President of Uganda the next day sent a note to the President saying how flattered he was when he read the newspapers that next day to find out what had been on the President's mind and what his long talk about Uganda education had postponed. So in addition to who and when, comes the question of what. Here is where the President showed his brilliance as a leader in sharp contrast to some others. He didn't say, give me an option, give me the best plan you have. No, he wanted to hear all of his options, and he wanted to know the pros and the cons of all of his options. And all his options included not only military action, and not only unilateral military action, but multilateral military action, and diplomacy. Not only unilateral diplomacy, but multilateral diplomacy, possibly acting through the United Nations or otherwise. He also wanted to hear the possibility, the pros and cons of doing nothing at all. As he put it, there are a lot of European countries that have lived next door to Soviet nuclear missiles. They've gotten used to it. Maybe we'll have to get used to it. He wanted to hear the pros and cons of that, although he felt, given the political, the heated political atmosphere that has been described to you today, the United States Congress and public would probably not accept doing nothing. And therefore we had to examine the other possibilities. That first day, the first suggestion on almost everyone's, the tip of everyone's tongue, was a so-called surgical air strike. Turned out there's no such thing, but that's what the military called it, a surgical air strike. Sounded good. U.S. airplanes swoop in, bomb those missile sites, fly away, and you've restored the status quo ante. Really? No, not on your life. First of all, as it was mentioned, I believe, previously, President, who was always asking hard, tough questions. How sure are we that that surgical airstrike will remove all of those missiles and that none will be left to be fired while we're attacking them and to take out 80 to 100 million people in the United States? Well, he was told, we think we could get 4/5 of them. That wasn't an acceptable solution. Then the military said, we're not just going to bomb the missile sites. There are also Soviet surface-to-air missiles in Cuba now. And by the way, it's very important to explain that all those refugee exile reports that Keating and Capehart were relying on, those refugees could not tell the difference. Why should they? I couldn't either, between a surface-to-air missile and an intercontinental ballistic missile. But the Air Force said, we've got to bomb all those also. We're not sending our planes over Cuba until we have knocked out all the Soviet surface-to-air missiles. And we're not going to send our planes there unless we bomb all of the Cuban airfields. They might send up fighter planes to combat our planes. And we also, to be prudent about it, we'd better bomb all the Cuban bombers, because they might come over and bomb Florida while we're bombing those missile sites. So pretty soon they had a list that showed bombing of the length and breadth of Cuba, which they said has to be followed by an invasion, because there would be chaos and in order to restore order. And as one leader of the what was by the press subsequently called the Hawks, we didn't use those terms within our discussions. One of the Hawks said, yes, Mr. President, this is your chance to go in and take Cuba away from Castro. So that leads me to my next, already forgotten what the next one was. Let's see. Oh, yes, well, what exactly? Well, what? I can go on, and I know our time is limited here, especially mine, because I was late. How? Exactly, how? Thank you. No Native American jokes, please. Robert Kennedy, in about our second or third meeting, I know it was the next day, but we were meeting constantly, day and night. Robert Kennedy pointed out that an air attack on a small island in which innocent people, such as all the workmen at the site, which would inevitably include Cubans as well as Russians, would sound to history a great deal like Pearl Harbor, and that a bombing attack without notice was unconscionable, and we had to give some kind of notice. Air Force said, we don't give notice to people we attack. And they said, if you give notice, the missiles will be hidden in caves or camouflaged in the forests of Cuba. And we're not sure about that. But the ex-com, as it came later to be called, discussed that, and finally I was picked to draft a note from a high-level special emissary of the president to go to Khrushchev and give him this letter of notice that we had discovered the missiles, and unless they were withdrawn, they would be bombed. Well, immediately upon my receiving that assignment, I began to receive instructions and conditions from everybody around the table. Well, it mustn't be an ultimatum because a great power doesn't respond to an ultimatum. It mustn't be complicated because Khrushchev will just negotiate it for weeks and the missiles will be completed and ready to fire. And it mustn't be too one-sided or overreaching, or if there's any posterity left after the Third World War, they'll blame the United States for starting it. And a series of other conditions are added to it. I went back to my office. I tried to draft such a note. I didn't believe in the bombing myself. It was a very difficult note to draft. I finally returned to the table and said, I just don't think it's possible to meet all those conditions. Of course, our warning that the missiles must be withdrawn will sound like an ultimatum. Of course, we're going to have conditions attached to it that he'll want to negotiate. Of course, it's going to seem one-sided to history, so on and so forth. That failure on my part to meet all the conditions caused people to back away from the notice idea and back away from the airstrike idea. And when that happened, there became more support for the approach that I believe Bob McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, had first suggested, which was a blockade. A blockade which went through several stages of evolution. It became not a traditional blockade, which would only invite the Soviets to put another blockade around West Berlin as they had in the late 1940s. Not a blockade which kept out food, medicine, gasoline, fuel, oil of any kind, which would collapse the Cuban economy. Instead, it was to be a blockade against offensive weapons. And so we renamed it, at the suggestion of Abe Shays, a quarantine against offensive weapons. For all we knew, the warheads, the nuclear warheads, were not yet in Cuba, and perhaps the blockade could prevent them from ever getting to Cuba, at least while attempts were made to resolve the crisis. The end of the crisis, already discussed by Stan Katz, came on Saturday, October 27th. This is the only time in my life when I can tell you what day of the week that particular date was. Saturday, October 27th, we had been discussing in the XCOM most of the morning and early afternoon that first letter that had come in the night before. It's been described so many different ways in so many different books that it's almost, having read it rather thoroughly under special conditions, I can tell you it was not peaceful in tone. It was full of threats, such as anything you do, we'll do twice as much to you, and denials. Mr. Khrushchev said, there are no offensive weapons. We put no offensive weapons in Cuba. I put them there for defensive reasons, and therefore they're defensive weapons. Even though they're capable of destroying the United States, we regard them as defensive. He didn't put that little parenthetical sentence in. So, nevertheless, that first letter did have at least the seeds of a potential agreement in it. And while our mission in UN mission in New York had drafted one reply, the State Department had drafted one reply, we were sitting there debating those replies, and another letter came in. And this second letter was broadcast in public. Khrushchev's clever way of trying to gain the upper hand in world opinion. And this one, the first one, sounded like it was a personal letter from Khrushchev, and I should have noted that for a year, and we can talk about this in the Q&A if there's time, for a year Kennedy and Khrushchev had a back channel of personal correspondence. And this came through that channel, that first letter, and we felt it from its tone that it came from Khrushchev personally, not the second letter. The second letter sounded like it had been drafted by the Soviet Presidium, or the Central Committee, and it was very tough, and demanded that the United States take the NATO missiles out of Turkey. They knew the United States could not unilaterally do that, and certainly could not do it in a short period of time, and nor would the United States fare well if it took them out because a gun was pointed at our head. Most of the Cold War deterrence rested on the fact that our allies in Europe believed that the United States would be willing to sacrifice its cities for European, in order to protect European cities, or to respond, to retaliate for any attack on European cities. Who would ever believe that if we made a deal to take missiles out of Turkey on our own because a gun was pointed at our head? And so that second letter made things look very dark indeed. Making it look even darker was the CIA brief that began the meeting, which said that submarines were accompanying the most recent approach to the quarantine barricade by Soviet vessels, indicating they intended to try and shoot their way through. Only decades later, only within the last decade did we discover that one of those submarines had nuclear torpedoes. We had never heard of nuclear torpedoes. Then more bad news came in. Our U-2 plane had been shot down. We depended on those U-2 planes, for which I give full credit to the CIA for all the bad knocks the CIA has taken over the years from liberals, intellectuals, and academics, like some of those gathered here. The CIA was brilliant in devising an aircraft that from 50,000 feet up could take pictures that were reportedly so clear you could tell whether a picnic table on the ground was covered with a tablecloth or not. But we depended on those planes to know what was going on. And an informal understanding had been reached at the very beginning of our deliberations that if a U-2 plane was ever shot down, we would respond by taking out the Soviet, and the Cubans didn't have that kind of equipment, the Soviet ground-to-air missile that took it out. And immediately the Joint Chiefs said, let's do that right now. And the President said, let's wait and see how this correspondence turns out. We continued to debate the correspondence. And then, although I would love to give full credit to my late friend Robert F. Kennedy for coming up with the idea, it was actually our most knowledgeable Soviet expert, Tommy Thompson in the State Department, who had been ambassador to Moscow, who knew Khrushchev personally, who suggested that we respond to the first letter and ignore the second letter. And I joined in that, and I said, yes, there are elements in that first letter which we could put a positive spin on. And the President said, all right, go ahead, go write that letter. And Bobby and I then went to my office down the hall and drafted that letter. That was totally against the climate of the conventional thinking at the times, corresponding with our adversary, in effect joining in negotiations with our adversary, but that's the answer to the what. That's what John F. Kennedy chose to do, and in addition to that, as has been mentioned here, when Bobby delivered that letter to Soviet Ambassador Dubrynin that evening, he was instructed to accompany it with 2 oral messages. One, that the hawks were rising, not a bad metaphor, and might insist on bombing Cuba in a matter of days. The other oral message was that the President the previous year had been advised that the missiles in Turkey were anachronistic, not that good, and should be removed. And we weren't going to do it in a deal. We weren't going to do it with a gun at our head. We weren't going to make that kind of public announcement. But if it helped Chairman Khrushchev save face at home or give him some other satisfaction, he could be assured, Bobby said, that those missiles in Turkey would be gone in a matter of months. So it was a form of communication and negotiation. Now, what was my next question? That's what. Why? Well, of course, why is what happened on October 22nd, because the President announced to the world, including the Congress and the American people, exactly what we were doing, not including the missile trade, that we had chosen a quarantine, that it would be accompanied by continued reconnaissance and surveillance, that it would be accompanied to the extent possible by diplomacy, that we were going to the United Nations, that we were appealing to the world, and that the reason and the evidence was hard, Soviet nuclear missile sites 90 miles from our shore in Cuba. He did not show pictures on that television address because he thought those might panic the American people, and the last thing we wanted was a panicky public, but did authorize Stevenson to show the pictures of the United Nations 3 days later. Far better than claiming we were going to war because of weapons of mass destruction, which no one had ever seen, and as we did against Iraq. But that speech on the evening of October 22nd went into some detail about what we were doing and why. The fact that the missiles had been rushed into Cuba under cover of deception, that we were being lied to. He even took advantage of the fact that Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko, during the very week we were formulating our plan, had come to pay a farewell call because he was leaving the UN to go back to Moscow, and the president asked him about Soviet activities in Cuba, and Gromyko lied about what they were doing, and that simply strengthened the president's case, and that was added to the speech. So that was the why. Let me now talk a little bit about the president personally. How could it be, since we're in the midst of a campaign now, where somebody same age as the president was at that time? No, actually, the candidate who's accused of being too young today is a year older than President Kennedy was at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. How could someone so young have such good judgment? Came for a variety of reasons. First of all, I think it was his sense of perspective. He was a man who loved to read history, who knew all about American history, diplomatic history, military history, who also had lived abroad when his father was ambassador to England, and you gain a different perspective about the United States and what it means to the rest of the world when you live abroad. Another advantage of that young candidate running these days who has spent considerable time living abroad. So that sense of perspective and history was all important in Kennedy formulating his mind. Secondly, he knew war, and he did not want war. As he would say in his American University speech, which I think was his greatest speech, many months later in June, the world knows this country will never start a war. This generation of Americans has had enough of war. He had served in that war, and two of his best friends had been killed, and he had had enough of war. And he was determined, and as was said already, even if the letter did not work, even if the quarantine didn't work, his plan was to try to take the same approach to the Russians through UTOP, the Secretary General of the United Nations. And finally, he had a sense of modesty. Hard for anybody who runs for president of the United States and who believes he has to be better than anyone else to lead the people to have a sense of modesty, but Kennedy had it. He also had a sense of humor. On that final day, when all those, one dark cloud had the submarine, the missile site preparation, the second letter, all those bad news reports kept coming in. One other came in, which is when the world was at its tensest, close to war, we received a report that a U.S. Air Force plane who had been asked to sample the air to find out if the Soviets were testing their nuclear weapons. Not an unreasonable request, because in fact we were testing our nuclear weapons. And he had, his navigational controls had failed, and by, you know, when you're at the North Pole, there's only one direction to go. He had flown out over Siberia. A U.S. Air Force plane is flying over Siberia when both sides are on the tenterhooks of war. And this comes in and it's announced as we're sitting around the table, and the president, as gloomy as it was in that room, said, well, there's always one son of a bitch who doesn't get the message. The sense of modesty was displayed after I woke up the next morning, October 28th, Sunday, and heard on the radio that Khrushchev had sent another letter out in the open, which was that he was withdrawing the missiles under UN inspection. I called George Bundy. By the way, I'm a little dubious about claims of tension between Bundy and Kennedy. Bundy's manner was perhaps a little sharp. He treated all his inferiors with disdain. Trouble is, everybody was his inferior. In any event, I called Bundy and he said, yes, it's true. Our meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock has been postponed until 11 or 11:30 because the President and Mrs. Kennedy are going to church, and he recommends that the rest of us do the same. Just before 11:30, he's back from church. I'm standing outside the cabinet room. The ex-com is gathered inside, so hardly able to believe their ears and eyes as to what has happened. When the President enters the room for the first time in all those 13 days, they will rise and applaud him. The President comes in and we stand there talking for a little bit. As we do, one of Mac Bundy's brightest and ablest deputies, Carl Kaysen, comes up to him and says, Mr. President, now would be a good time for you to settle the India-China border dispute, which had broken out into fighting during that same 13-day period. We thought maybe it was part of a worldwide conspiracy. And the President shook his head and he said, no, I don't think either side will be too interested in hearing from me. And Carl said, but Mr. President, today you're 10 feet tall. The President said, that'll last a couple of weeks. It's lasted to this day, which is why I'm very pleased and proud to present it to you today. Thank you. By the way, just because I can't see you, don't worry about my eyesight. I have more vision than the President of the United States.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the panelists for 3 really wonderful talks. We have, I'm afraid, run out of time, so we're not going to have time for an open discussion. We may have a little time up here if you want to come forward. But would you please join me in thanking all 3 speakers for this presentation.